Hey everybody, this is Mark Orenberger, host of the Graphic Novel Apostle podcast. Our podcast this week is a bonus episode, and it's something that's going to be quite different from what we normally do. In fact, there won't be any discussion of graphic novels or comic books, and probably the thing that makes the most sense to do is to think of this as an addendum to our True Cult episode that came out last week. And if you haven't heard it, it was a good episode, I think, anyway. I would encourage you to go back one episode in our podcast feed and check out that episode on True Cult, where my friend Michael Crump joined me to talk about that book, which was written by Scott Bryan Wilson, with art by Leanna Kangas, and published by IDW Publishing. During that recording session, we got to talking about music a little bit, and it made some sense to talk about that in the context of the book that we were discussing. But it also ended up being a much larger discussion than would have made sense to include in that episode. We had started talking about an idea that my friend Jonathan Warren had to do a playlist of his 15 favorite albums called 45 from 15, where he had chosen 3 tracks from each of his 15 favorite records. Well, Crump and I decided to do a 40 from 20 playlist, each of us, because we couldn't stop ourselves at 15 albums apiece. We each took 20, and we had what turned out to be about a 45-minute discussion about each of the records on our lists and why we chose them. I love talking about music. This was a really fun conversation. As you'll see as you get into this, Crump and I have a lot of shared musical interests and tastes, but we both get into some areas that the other doesn't know much about either, and that's kind of neat, too, to share. But I wanted to provide this bit of context for you as we go into the episode, because otherwise, it would feel like you were just being dropped into the middle of a conversation about music on a comic book podcast. There are also some references to True Cult and the creators of that book throughout, and that's because this conversation took place actually while we were recording our True Cult episode. I hope you enjoy the discussion that follows. I hope you find some new music that might interest you, or this gives you an opportunity to revisit some old friends, some old records that you've loved over the course of your lifetime. I'll put a link to my playlist and also to Crump's in the show notes for this show. There'll be Spotify playlists, so if you want to check those things out there, you're welcome to. And I always love to hear your feedback, so write to me at graphicnovelapostle@gmail.com. Let me know what records we foolishly left out of our lists. And if this music talk isn't your cup of tea, hey, that's all right. Come on back next week on Monday morning, and we will have entry number 2 in our Batman the Long Halloween podcast series. And we'll be looking at Batman the Long Halloween issue 2, which is set in November and involves a murder around Thanksgiving. That'll be a lot of fun. Hope to see you here then. And I'm going to go ahead and play that silly little intro that we have now at the beginning of the show, and then we'll get into that conversation. I hope you guys enjoy the show.
Once a month, when the moon reaches its highest point in the sky and the wild creatures call out to the night, he emerges from a private sanctuary in an undisclosed location outside of Little Rock, Arkansas. Arrayed in his priestly vestments, carrying forth the good news that comic books and graphic novels aren't just for kids, that they aren't just mass and spandex superheroes, that storytelling in a graphic format can be so much more. He is the Graphic Novel Apostle.
Well, let's get into it.
Yeah.
You want to go ahead and hit us up with your list first?
Yeah, I can start with that. I mean, I love a good playlist. I love a good mixtape, or back in the CD era, you'd make a CD for somebody, friends, the opposite sex, whatever it may be. So you may just jump in by artist or album and just go through the list and kind of a little bit. Do you want to go back and forth? How do you want to?
No, let's do all you and then we'll do all me.
Okay.
I was thinking about back and forth, but I think, get the full flavor of Michael Crump first. But actually, I want to say this. In that same interview I was talking about earlier where Scott Bryan Wilson talked about the True Cult idea, Leanna Kangas was talking about making a playlist for each character. And while drawing the book, listening to the playlist that sort of suited that character in their mind. And I just think that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And so, by the way, I should also say there will be at the center of this book, it's not exactly a MacGuffin, but an object that becomes an object of pursuit throughout this book is an all-black record that is the True Cult record that has maybe some special powers, and we'll talk about it. But you give me your 20 not black metal records.
Sure. And as you describe what Jonathan did, that makes sense because I didn't, I could have put the Beatles on here or Bob Marley or some of those. They're like great artists that I love. But you're right. I stuck to kind of these were the albums that I just kind of wore out. So I'll start off with the first one I put on my list was Tears for Fears. It was songs from the Big Chair. And I might have to click on this to remember all the album titles because I just had the list of songs. Tears for Fears. Always loved them back in the day. Recently jumped back in and realized I was not giving them all the proper due they deserve. They're an amazing band. So that was one. Peter Gabriel. It was really hard. You can see I'm wearing my Peter Gabriel shirt from the concert I went to last fall. My wife gave me a hard time about wearing this here for this. But Peter Gabriel, they call it the Car album because the first several albums he had back in the 70s were all just Peter Gabriel, but they had different album covers. So
that's cool.
Yeah, there's like the Melted Face album, the Car album. Anyway.
And that's one of those things before you go on, Crump, that you and I have shared so much music back and forth. You've turned me on to stuff. I know I've turned you on to a few bands, but every now and then, like when I saw your playlist and how many 80s heavy bands there were, I was like, that's right. There is several years difference between me and Crump.
Yeah, it's kind of, as I was going through this and making notes, you talked about how, albums might remind you of something or some time. And I can kind of divide them into, Peter Gabriel and a couple of these others were like that formative time when I'm like 11 to 14, sort of figuring out what I like. And then there's sort of your college years. There's a group of albums on here that's like when my wife and I were first dating and first, moved in together. These are the albums we listened to all the time. So right. Yeah, you just kind of jump in that way. So Peter Gabriel was one. I love Peter Gabriel so much. The Genesis stuff is really interesting if you never listened to when he was in Genesis. I don't know if you've ever seen any of the concerts from the 70s when Peter Gabriel was in Genesis.
No, never.
Do yourself a favor, go to YouTube. Go look up Genesis, Peter Gabriel. You'll be amazed.
Okay.
Jason Isbell. I think you and I both share a love of Jason Isbell.
And we both had that record, Southeastern.
Yeah, Southeastern was the album I picked here. Sometimes that's the hard part of these artists that have so many great albums is deciding which one. But that one to me was kind of the one where he really broke out, and I love every track on this album. So next one, Pearl Jam, Versus. Versus came out when I was in college. That album, we'd go to Hastings. That was back when you still went at midnight. The album came out, and
yes.
I've never experienced so much excitement. There were just so many people in line. Everybody in the store. The store's not even normally open that late. Just waiting for this album to come out so you can go pick up your CD and start listening. So Versus by Pearl Jam. This one, Childish Gambino. That one's a little bit of a curveball for me. I haven't listened to a lot of rap in years, but just something about. He's just an amazing actor. Donald Glover, he's incredible.
Sure, and that must be one of the. I know there are a couple of bands on here that your daughters turned you on to.
No, actually, it's funny you say that because I don't play this around my daughters or my wife. It's kind of really anyone but me in the car. If you haven't listened to this album in particular, Camp, his first one, it's not exactly appropriate for mixed company. There's.
I'll tell you though, on one of the tracks that you included on your playlist. He had the line, Terry Gross on the mic, I'm the talk of the nation. I was like, yes.
I'm telling you, if you go back and listen to Childish Gambino, you will listen to some of his songs over and over. And then a year from now, you'll still pick up on something like, oh my God, I didn't catch that phrase right there. There's one joke he makes about Casey Anthony on it. It's not really, it's kind of dark, but
I would imagine
yeah, so Childish Gambino, I love Donald Glover, and I fell in love with this album. The next one is the one, 21 Pilots. That's one of the ones that really my daughters turned me on to. Went to one of their concerts, and I fell in love with them. And then my kids kind of fell out of love with. So now I'm like still gung-ho. I'd love to go see them if they came close. I don't even know if I could talk them into coming to the shows with me anymore. They kind of moved on, but I couldn't move on because once I make that commitment, I don't move on. So
I remember you working pretty hard during those years trying to turn me on to 21 Pilots.
Yeah, Vessel was the album that I picked out of there because that one was just fantastic. Prince was my next one. Purple Rain. If you're of a certain age in the early to mid 80s, my friends and I, my brother, we would dress up and go to my neighbors. And when I say neighbor, the closest neighbor where I grew up was about a quarter of a mile away, and probably my only neighbor. But when my friend was down visiting his mom who lived next door, we'd go out in the front yard with our boombox. We'd put on whatever we could make into costumes, and we just put on Purple Rain. And it was quite an experience. The Police was my next one. Zenyatta, Mondatta. Love the Police, Sting. Those were just two of my favorite artists. Obviously, Sting crosses both, but Zenyatta, Mondatta was that album where they kind of moved on from that punk reggae sound, because they kind of, a lot of artists kind of come up and adapt to whatever seems to be popular then, sure. Even if that's not. The Stones put out a disco album, even though they were much more established. But a lot of people, you find you're in to get some airplay.
Sure.
And this is the album I thought where they kind of moved on from that punk reggae, which I loved, and really started to show just what amazing musicians and songwriters those three guys were. So.
I don't think I ever listened to any Police music that wasn't from that reggae era. And it cracks me up because I forget that, like, oh yeah, this is basically a reggae band.
And they still have some elements of that. One of the songs I put on there, Canary in a Coal Mine, kind of still has a little bit of that reggae beat, but you can still start to feel sort of they're moving, to something a little different. And I love reggae. I mentioned Bob Marley. Nothing wrong with some good reggae, but that album really stood out for me. Men at Work was my next one. Men at Work was the first band for me. My uncle, about 10 years older than me, about the same distance as the two of us. When I was a kid, he would play the Beatles all the time. Still the biggest Beatles fan I've ever met. And so I grew up with almost exclusive, a little bit of the Monkees, but mostly the Beatles, listening to that. So this Men at Work was kind of my first band. Like, that was the first band that I fell in love with. It was like, this is my thing.
Yeah.
And they only put out, 2 albums and then a third album when half the band went back to Australia and really didn't want to be famous anymore. But Men at Work was all over the airwaves for a little while, and then kind of went away for a long time. And Colin Hay, many years later, comes back and sort of this resurgence, which is really interesting to listen to. He's such a great storyteller.
Well, I know you're
solo stuff.
Diehard Colin Hay fan.
Love the guys. The concert experience is phenomenal with him.
I can't remember. Do you have a Colin Hay solo record on your list?
I don't think I put one of his solo records on there. There were several artists on here that it was like, I've got, like Peter Gabriel, there are several that I'm like, I could put an album from the band, or I put Ben Folds 5 on this list.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
There's several Ben Folds solo albums. I thought it was I kind of covered my bases by just picking one or the other, but easily could have put a Colin Hay solo album on this list too. The Cranberries, the No Need to Argue album, it's phenomenal. I guess that was their second album. This is one of those albums, like I said, when my wife and I first started dating, we would just listen to all the time. And I love the Cranberries. Dolores O'Riordan, when she passed away a few years ago, she was the exact same age as me. That one really hit me hard when she passed away unexpectedly. Toad the Wet Sprocket was the next one on the list. Similarly, same era, but always loved Toad the Wet Sprocket. Glenn Phillips, I think Nickel Creek is one of your favorites, right? And I think Glenn does a lot of work with Nickel Creek.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I love Nickel Creek, and they did a project called the Mutual Admiration Society. They put out one record under that title, and it was basically Nickel Creek with Glenn Phillips and maybe John Paul Jones on the drums.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, it was kind of one of those, and I loved that music. When Walk on the Ocean came out as a single, I loved that song. Mm-hmm. And that's when I was just coming of age to like sort of find my own music. Yeah. And so that was an early CD purchase for me. I never got as much into the whole album, but I certainly loved that song.
They're interesting because they hit the airwaves the same time that kind of grunge was becoming this big, and they could not be less grunge than Toad the Wet Sprocket. But Glenn Phillips is amazing. We met him when they played at what's the Juanita's?
Yeah.
Before it finally went under, met him there, and he did a thing during COVID where I guess just trying to make ends meet or just to put his music out there. He was doing like a couple of nights a week. He would just come on with his guitar and just do shows on Facebook or something, and you could comment and tune in. It was fantastic to kind of pass the time. The next one I have on the list is The Replacements. I don't know how familiar you are with The Replacements, because, again, this might be a little before your time.
Well, you know what? They are, but it's one of those things where, like, I know that's a blind spot in music that goes right along with other music I love. Mm-hmm. And so it's The Replacements and Big Star are the two bands that I know people are like, oh, you're a big Elvis Costello fan, or you're big into...
You should try these.
Yeah, you should try these. And I've never gotten around to it.
Well, Paul Westerberg, the lead singer of The Replacements, when the singles soundtrack came out, he had a couple of... I don't know. I guess it was record deal connections. It didn't really fit with the rest of it, but he's on there with a couple of songs, and he's if you go back and start listening, they were kind of that ultimate garage band. They have you should just research their history. There's a great book, I forget his name, that wrote about this and the connection with Big Star and just their history. Big Star influenced, they were from Memphis, influenced the Replacements. And the Replacements are one of those bands that I think they probably should have been even bigger than they were. They had a bit of a drinking problem. Okay. Funny stories you'll read about where they didn't even know what day of the week it was. And if you caught them on the right night, they were amazing and everything was so tight. But if you caught them the next night, it might be a little sketchy, just seeing what they were doing. But the Replacements were a fantastic band that a lot of other bands were influenced by. So put them on the list. The next one you're familiar with, the Decemberists. I love the Decemberists.
So Crump, no album from the Decemberists made it on the list for me, but easily could have. They'd be in that bubble, like 5 records or so that I would have loved to have gotten on there. And that's largely under your influence. You really turned me on to the Decemberists.
Well, and I guess I didn't mention the albums that they were from because I just kind of get rolling on here. But I mean, this particular album, I guess I don't even know if I pronounce it correctly. Picaresque.
Oh yeah, right.
Is the album here. The Crane Wife is what kind of got me into.
So the Crane Wife is the record I'd have put on, or The King is Dead.
Yeah, The King is Dead is, if I had to put that up, I probably could have put that one easily because that is a fantastic, and it's so much different than what most of their other catalog was. But the Crane Wife is what introduced me to them, and then I love that about a band when you discover them after a while. They've been around a little while, and you don't have to wait. You could just, oh my God, there's 7 albums I can go back and explore. That's kind of the way it was for me with the Decemberists, working my way back. And then I've been to see them a few times. So went to see them in St. Louis this last spring with my daughter and my wife, one of my daughters. So that one was in there. Then I had the next one is Live, Throwing Copper. Everybody thinks Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, but for me, the 90s, like the best, like the most quintessential album from that era was Throwing Copper.
Yeah.
I really loved them in their first album that came out, and at that time, Mental Jewelry. I had one friend that knew who Live were, but this album, Throwing Copper, was just, there's not a bad track on it. I mean, front to back.
So Throwing Copper was a big middle school record for me.
Okay.
And it was another one where it's like, okay, I'm discovering my own music, and Lightning Crashes, oh my gosh. Man, put a CD in my Discman, and I listened to that 7,000 times. I've gone back in the last few years, and that record for me doesn't hold up as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, there's some bangers on there. There's no doubt about it. And, I love the ambiance of that music, or just the feel of it. But, man, Lightning Crashes forever.
Yeah. It's a great song. I remember when I first opened that album up, put it in, that song just jumped out. And it didn't really sound like anything else, kind of. It had that sort of 90s slow, soft, fast, kind of that tempo change. But other than that...
Yeah, but it wasn't exactly grunge.
It wasn't, no, not at all. Ben Folds 5 was the next one I had on here. The Unauthorized Biography of Reinhold Messner was the album I picked here. It was their last album. But again, I think every track on it is so fantastic.
I was really excited when I saw that you had chosen that album. You and I have gone to see Ben Folds together before, and that's another band we've shared over the years a lot of love for. And I had considered, I don't think a Ben Folds record made it on mine. I thought about his original Ben Folds 5, self-titled album.
Yeah.
And I thought about putting on Whatever and Ever Amen.
Yeah.
And then I also thought about Reinhold Messner. That was an album I listened to a lot when I was in law school. And you can't go wrong. You know what, though? Probably the record I would have landed on was Songs for Silverman.
Oh, the solo album, yes.
Was that a solo?
That was his solo album.
Okay.
But you mentioned that, and that's one of the things I wrote in my notes was Ben Folds 5, the Reinhold Messner album, and then Rockin' the Suburbs, which is his first solo album. I don't know of many artists where their last band album and the first solo are both that strong. Because, typically... A lot of bands, I mentioned the Replacements, All Shook Down was their last one together. A lot of bands they're petering out. They're starting to not get along. Their creativity is going in opposite directions, but they finished really strong and then just stopped.
Yeah.
But then he picked right up and kept going. So yeah, that one made my list. This next one, you probably weren't even that familiar with, but New Edition is one of the Heartbreak, N.E. Heartbreak album. I was really big into R&B in the late 80s when I was in high school. I did not like hair bands much.
Okay.
That was just not my thing.
You and Marty would not have gotten along.
Yeah, I love that. I really identify with the fact that he just buying tapes was his thing. And like, he was so into music, and I kind of identified with the time in his life and a period in mind. But yeah, we definitely would have diverged, especially during that period of my life. But I loved New Edition in the 80s, but a lot of R&B, because I just Poison and Motley Crue. I guess Def Leppard, they weren't really a hair band, but I did like Def Leppard.
Okay.
During that era, but otherwise not much. The next one's a huge one, R.E.M. I mean, you and I had a conversation about R.E.M. one night recently. It may have been actually what spawned me to do this list, as we were talking about R.E.M.
Okay.
And you mentioned your list, but Automatic for the People.
That's the same one that shows up on my list.
Yeah, I mean, it may not be every R.E.M. fan's favorite album, but just something about that record.
Oh, man.
Just...
It's so beautiful.
It is.
And you know what's funny is, like, when people think about that record, at least at the time, the go-to big breakout hit was Everybody Hurts.
Yeah.
And that was played so much on MTV and VH1 at the time that I've gotten to where I can barely listen to that song anymore. And I'll listen to every other track on the record.
Yeah. No, I'm the same.
And R.E.M. Automatic for the People was another one of those early formative records for me, where I know the first time I heard it was on a cassette tape, but I bought it for myself on CD, and I like have distinct memories of like sitting in the car while my parents have gone in to like go shopping in a store or something like that with my headphones, just listening to
my experience was the same, except I had the yellow cassette.
Yep.
I actually remember sitting in the car. I was much older than you, so I was in that sort of lost loser portion of my life where I was in between my first go at college and going back when this album came out.
Doesn't make you a loser.
I know, but it makes me identify with Marty, right? So okay. Kind of trying to find myself where I fit. But yeah, that yellow cassette, and this album I think was the one where Stipe's vocals really, you could really make out his vocals a lot more clearly than some of their earlier stuff.
That's true for sure.
And just it had this kind of melancholy thing that it was just such a beautiful record. The next one, Carbon Leaf. You introduced me to Carbon Leaf.
I was so proud when I saw this was on your list, and I knew you loved Carbon Leaf.
I do.
But like, just to know that was a band I'd introduced you to and ended up on your top 20 made me feel so happy.
Indian Summer was the album I picked out, but One Prairie Outpost in particular is such a great song. And I follow them on social media. I've not seen them yet in person. That's one of the few left on my bucket list. They do tour a lot, so I'm going to catch them at some point. But
so Carbon Leaf is based out of, I believe, Richmond, Virginia. And so I was introduced to them when I was in law school at William and Mary in Williamsburg, just about an hour down the road from there. And funny, another like band you introduce somebody to, my dad and I have always shared a lot of music love, like going back to, I was so influenced by his LP record collection when I was a little kid. But he came to visit me one time when I was in college, and we were sitting in the living room of this little house that me and a couple of guys were renting, and we just had some music playing in the background. And he just stopped, and he was like, "What is this?" He put his ear right up to the speaker, and he's like, "This is gorgeous. What is this?" It was David Gray's White Letter album, and so that's been a band that like I was so excited because I had always been influenced by his music, especially Billy Joel. You know, that was a all-time favorite for me, and he brought me up on that. And then,
so how old were you when you were listening to these albums that you're talking about of his?
Oh, like down to when I was a kid. Like we'd put on like The Stranger or something like that. Some of those '80s Billy Joel records, and my dad would lay on the couch in the living room, and my sister and I would like put our arms out to the side and spin around until we got dizzy, and then fall on the floor, and we'd be listening to Uptown Girl. Or whatever.
I asked because I mentioned the Beatles with my uncle, but a little before that, my parents would play a lot of James Taylor, Jim Croce, a lot of that singer-songwriter era.
Oh, Cat Stevens?
Yeah, which that may be why I'm so into I like lyrics. I'm just really big into the lyrics and the melody.
Yeah.
Those are the two big things for me is really listening, but probably because I came up on that singer-songwriter era.
Same. So Gordon Lightfoot.
Yes.
Harry Chapin is really the one that I've, people know Cats in the Cradle and often not much more than that from him. Holy cow, that dude was awesome. But to go back to where I was going with all this, a couple of friends of mine and I, in my first year of law school, went up to, it was one of those colleges just outside of D.C. to see David Gray play. And the opening act was Carbon Leaf, because they were sort of like the local opener. Yeah. And then they blew me away. And then like 2 years later, they came and played at William and Mary. And it was just like in this theater on campus. And when they got done, they said, hey, we're going to be, just out in the lobby. Like, we'll have our merch table set up. Come talk to us. I talked for like 20 minutes to those guys. I'd been playing guitar a lot back then, acoustic, and my parents at Christmas had gotten me a mandolin. And so I was messing around with that mandolin, and, that band is mandolin heavy. Yeah. And so I talked to their mandolin player about, like his influences. But when you got into that a couple of years later, when I came back to Little Rock, I was so happy.
I think it was when I said something to you about the Decemberists, you're like, well, you should check out Carbon Leaf. And ever since then, you're right, mandolin and the whistle. You don't hear a lot of
the penny whistle.
Yeah, that Celtic, that whistle sound you hear in there is kind of stands out too. The next, I had two more on my list. I had of Monsters and Men. It was what is it called? My Head is an Animal, I think was the name of that album. Man, it's just such a great. When you listen to it, like I would just feel like I was on some big adventure. Like, the sound of that album is so huge. You feel like you're in I wrote down, and I thought this at the time, I got this Viking sort of like,
they're from what? Like Iceland?
They're from Iceland. So you feel it. And then reading later, I read a couple of years later, I read some quotes from the band where they're like, yeah, that's exactly what we were thinking about when we wrote this album. I'm thinking, well, you nailed it, because it makes me feel like I'm just like, in this huge adventure, and these landscapes, they're just giant, which that's Iceland, I guess, that's the way it would come across if you're from there. But the last one I had on mine was Midnight Oil. I don't know how familiar you are with Midnight Oil, but from Australia. God, they've been around. I guess they recently did like their last, they said it was their last concert ever. And those guys have been around since, I don't know, the mid 70s. And if you haven't listened to them a lot, I don't think there's any band in the history of modern music that loves their country, and you can hear it in their songs as much as Midnight Oil loves Australia.
No kidding. Okay.
Oh my God. Which, they're Peter Garrett, the lead singer. I think he actually served, I forget, there was a period of time where he ran for office. I can't remember what his position was, but just very active. I think it probably bothers some people, they're just sort of activist guys, but their music is fantastic. I mean, it's just, and such a deep catalog. So if you ever get a chance to check out Midnight Oil, you really should. Which album did I even put on here? I can't remember which album I put on here. It looks like it was Blue Sky Mine.
Okay.
Blue Sky Mining, I think, was the name of that album. And also one last thing on the list in this album, my cousin Jay, I'll never forget. This album was blue. The cassette was blue, and he and his aunt Felicia bought this for me for my birthday, whatever year that was, and they were the first band, I think, alternative label. Like, I think it may have been the MTV Awards or one of the award shows, could have even been the Grammys. It was their first ever award for alternative act. Okay. And Midnight Oil won that. I don't know if people would think of them as alternative now, but Midnight Oil was the last one on my 20. And like you said, 20 it's not enough.
Yeah.
But it's also a lot when you start.
That's exactly right. And by the way, I should say, I've made an executive decision during this recording here. What we're going to do is the segment where you and I have gone through our 20 albums list. It's going to be a separate podcast episode that I'm going to release in the feed.
It's hard to talk about an album and just talk about it for 10 seconds.
That's exactly right. And, we're tackling 40 albums here. And maybe, just maybe, not everyone wants to listen to that.
I agree.
But I think they should. And so I'm going to give them the opportunity to.
If they're music fans like us, I think they would probably appreciate it.
Yeah, that's right. Well, so let me go through mine now. And Crump, I love it, man. I'm gonna check out some Midnight Oil because I really do not know them. I was thinking of the Midnight Special. So definitely not what you were getting at there. All right, so let me go through mine records. My first album, and these are in no particular order. Elvis Costello and the Attractions, My Aim is True. That very first record that he did came out in 1977, and it had Allison on it, which of course is fitting for having a lead character named Allison, or one of our leads in this book. But for me, the song, The Angels Want to Wear My Red Shoes, is what just totally makes this. But that record is front to back.
Love Elvis Costello, and that song, good. Allison in particular.
And by the way, Elvis Costello is one of the best live acts I've ever seen.
Really?
I saw him, there was this club, and I'll probably mention it a few times while we go through these records. When I was living in Williamsburg, Virginia, there was a club down in Norfolk called the Norva. It was a rock club, but it brought, I saw Bob Dylan there one time.
Oh,
I mean, huge acts would come through. But I saw Elvis Costello there, and he had It was when his album The Delivery Man had come out. So I think this was 2004 or early 2005. And he had like a rack with like 15 different guitars that he brought up on the stage. He probably played every single one of them. I'm sure they were all just tuned a little differently or whatever. And so much energy. This guy would have been in his 60s at that time. Big time energy. So in that same era for me, my buddy Mike Monahan, we had this little crew of friends in law school that really hung around a lot together, and 3 of them were named Mike. But it was sort of easy because 2 of them were in the service in different branches. So Mike Monahan was Navy Mike, and then we had my buddy Army Mike, and then civilian Mike, I guess, was the other.
Everyone was named Mike or Mark or David for quite a long time. My wife does the same thing because I have several Marks, and it's really confusing. So,
by the way, I was wishing you and Nancy a happy anniversary the other day on Facebook, and I wrote it as like, happy birthday, Crump and Nancy. It's not that we need to distinguish you as the particular Michael, but you're a Crump to me. But anyway, in that same era, my buddy Navy Mike had turned me on to Cake, and their first record, Motorcade of Generosity, is high on my list here. And my first real introduction to them was going down to the Norva with Navy Mike and seeing Cake in concert. And they were doing that song, I'll forget the title of the song itself, but it's the one that's like, sheep go to heaven, goats go to hell. Right? John McCrae, the lead singer, divided the whole audience in half, sort of like Ben Folds does.
That's with the Army. I think it's Army, isn't it?
On Army, right, yeah, where he has everybody kind of pretend to be a different instrument. But with this, he had half the audience be the sheep and half the audience go be the goats. And so he'd point to one side, and you'd have all the crowd on one side of the room yelling, sheep go to heaven. And then you'd have the other side just yelling at their friends in the crowd, go to hell. Right? It's so fun. And they're a band that Natalie and I have seen a bunch of times together in concert. All right, next, Weezer's Blue album.
Oh, yeah.
Man, for the longest time, Pinkerton was my favorite Weezer album. But in the long run, it's got to be the Blue album.
Absolutely.
I think of all the bands of my generation that came out in the 90s, I think the hardest rocking one of all of them in mainstream, rock music was Weezer.
Yeah.
Dude, that album is just kick your teeth in
Say
rock
It
and
Ain't
roll.
So, My Name is Jonas. I mean, it's just
man.
so many tracks on that.
Absolutely. So this is a bit of a curveball, but I went through a big phase where I just loved G-Love and Special Sauce. And the album Philadelphonic in particular was a record that, man, when I identified this as a record that probably needed to go on my list, and I've been going around in the car listening to my playlist some, I get most excited, maybe of anything, when the G-Love tracks come on. All right, so next I had The Head and the Heart.
Oh, I love that.
And their solo, or not solo, their first album, which was self-titled. And I think of you a lot of the time when I think of The Head and Heart. So you and I went, this was probably, 2012, 2013, something like that?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Over to Memphis to the Beale Street Music Festival, often just referred to as Memphis in May. And so people have heard me talk on the podcast before about how little, maybe I should say, Natalie and I have in common. And for all my love of live music, and actually we ought to talk about your wife here in a second too, but for all my love of live music, she hates it. She hates crowds. She hates live music that doesn't sound exactly like it does on the album. She doesn't like whatever, all of it. And so her rule for as long as we've been married has been, Mark, you can go to any concert you want on the condition that I don't have to go. So The Head and the Heart were coming to Memphis in May, and you and I both wanted to go see it. You live way out in the wilderness in a town called Humnoke. Is that
correct? Which Humanoke, as the locals would say, but Humnoke.
I never knew that.
Yeah, locals will say Humanoke.
Is that right?
I don't know where the comes from, but it's in there.
Now, when we say the locals in Humanoke, I mean, that's just like you and your wife and your daughters when they're home from college.
I live in the suburbs of Humanoke. Really.
Oh, I see.
Humanoke, but I think the population is 219.
Okay, so the greater Humanoke area.
Yeah, I'm actually I think you knew this, but I'm the city attorney for Humnoke. So
I forget that. Yeah, yes, I did know that.
It's a big job.
Well, it's a big job that you do in your free time.
Yeah, one night a month for about an hour and a half, maybe. Yeah.
Very good. So Natalie and I went and picked you up in Humanoke. and we drove on over to Memphis, and Natalie dropped us off outside the Beale
like
Street
you're in
Music
junior high or
Festival.
something.
Like we were kids. And this is so quintessentially Natalie, because this was her idea to do. She was like, you're going to go up to Memphis? Well, I'll go to the zoo. So she dropped us off there. She drove to the Memphis Zoo. She found an area in the, I guess where they have like the dolphins or something, where you can go in and it's air conditioned. And she sat on a bench for like 4 hours and knitted and watched the dolphins. And then she came back and picked us up after the Head and the Heart concert.
Call my mom. She's going to come pick us up from the concert. But then the other part of that, I guess I don't know if you've ever said anything about it on any of your podcasts.
I have not.
But you have, concert. So we run into, I think it was, the Turnpike Troubadours, maybe?
Yeah, it was Turnpike Troubadours and the Avett Brothers.
The Avett Brothers were probably really more so what, I don't know if you were a big fan of Turnpike.
I didn't even stay for all of Turnpike.
Okay, so I love both of those. But we were walking in and just run into you in the parking lot, and there's a woman with you, and it's not Natalie, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, is this, what should I say? But you quickly made sure to tell everyone, this is my friend, my wife, it's my concert wife, I think is as you explained it. Natalie is fine with me going with pick out some friends and go. So yeah, at first we were kind of taken aback when we saw you with a different woman walking into the show.
Well, and I could tell, like, Nancy did not give me a warm greeting when I saw her that night. So I had to make sure we let her know. Yeah, my friend Becky, and we will have Becky Bell on this podcast for sure. But my friend Becky, anytime there's a band that comes around, she knows that Becky and I have a lot of similar tastes in music. Mm-hmm. And I'll be like, Natalie, Nickel Creek is going to come play at the hall. She'll be like, you think Becky's free? Could take you that weekend?
Was Becky at the Jason Isbell show that we went to?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that was a little unusual too, because you asked me because you had an extra ticket.
Yeah.
And it was you and two of your female friends.
Yeah, Becky and Michelle.
Yeah, and the two of us, which was kind of just interesting. I mean, I'm again with my readers looking at my phone in the middle of the crowd, but that was
we weren't exactly picking up women there. Yeah.
No, definitely not.
That's all right. So moving next, man, when I was in college, my friend David Scharf turned me on to the Grateful Dead, and I will owe him forever for it.
That's how I knew I had the right house when I pulled up, by the way. I saw the bear on the door. I was like, okay, this is the right house.
Yeah, that's right. So Natalie got one of her friends several years ago, who is a very crafty person that she worked with, to make this like big door hanger that's the blue Grateful Dead dancing bear, and it just says Orenberger across his orange bib.
I'm really interested because I've known you were a Grateful Dead guy for years, and just I don't know if you take this any certain way, but when I look at Mark Orenberger, I would have never thought Grateful Dead.
Yeah, I don't put off much of a stoner vibe or anything like that. But so we'll get to Dave Matthews in a minute. I mean, I was a huge Dave Matthews fan, and I think, depending on what age you are, like Dave Matthews could be a gateway drug to the Grateful Dead or vice versa, and Fish and, so many other bands. But the Grateful Dead record, American Beauty, they did like this studio session in 1970 where they came out of the studio with two very different records, American Beauty and Working Man's Dead. And Working Man's Dead is more like heavily blues influenced, and American Beauty is more folk influenced and gospel almost. And I love them both, but for me, American Beauty just stands head and shoulders over the top. So I had that same Jason Isbell record, Southeastern, that you had. And I'll say, like, if we came back 10 years from now, I might still pick Southeastern, but I also think the album that came out last year that had Cast Iron Skillet on it, I can't remember the name of that record.
Weather Vanes.
Weather Vanes, thank you so much. If we come back 10 years from now and do this again, like, I could see Weather Vanes potentially being there.
Absolutely.
In place of Southeastern. All right, so next, Paul Simon's Graceland album. This is an all-time great. And I went through this phase in college where my roommate, Chad Eason, he and I were such good friends. We had a great, like, roommate kind of relationship where we hung out together, we got along together, we knew, like, how not to get on each other's nerves mostly. With the exception being, I would get up every morning and, while we were getting ready for class, put on Paul Simon's Graceland album, which, it's got like some first of all, he'd gone to South Africa to record it with all these South African musicians. You've got Ladysmith Black Mambazo on there, all these cool musicians, but there are a bunch of different, like there's Zydeco kind of music on there. And I remember Chad saying to me one day, like, Mark, I'll stop doing whatever this thing was that was annoying me for a while. He's like, if you stop putting on that polka music every morning before we go to class.
My roommates, it was the Eagles' Greatest Hits cassette, and they would play that anytime we had people over. I mean, just constantly. And I hid it from them one weekend. I was going somewhere, and I hid that cassette. I just had to get back at them, but they just wore that thing out. Not that I hate the Eagles, but I just was not near as enamored with their Greatest Hits album, so I get it.
All right, so next, man, you mentioned Juanitas a few minutes ago. Mm-hmm. Like, let's pour a drink out on the concrete for Juanitas and so many great bands that we've seen there over the years. But Sunvolt and their record Wide Swing Tremolo. No, I'm sorry, their record Trace is the one I had on here. Tear Stained Eye, Windfall. Holy smokes. And I saw them like 4 or 5 times at Juanitas.
It's funny because I'm not a huge Sunvolt guy, but both those songs, I have like a sort of a master playlist of just songs that I think are great. Uh-huh. Those 2 songs are on there. They might be the only 2 Sunvolt songs I know. Huh. And of course on Weather Vanes, Jason Isbell makes reference to listening to Sunvolt.
That's right, in White Beretta.
Yeah, which he's talking about driving to Memphis. So a lot of tie-ins here with what we've been talking about.
Isn't that
today.
Crazy?
Yeah.
All right, so next, Car Wheels on a Gravel Road by Lucinda Williams. And she's another one. I'd seen at Juanitas a couple of times, but my first time to ever even hear of her was one year when I was in college at the Beale Street Music Festival, and Counting Crows was going to play later in the night. And so, sometimes you got to just like pick your stage and stay there, because if you try and bounce back and forth, you miss everything. Mm-hmm. And so I went like 2 acts ahead of Counting Crows. And this woman, Lucinda Williams, wanders onto the stage, and I was like, who is this old lady in leather pants? And like, what is this? And she started playing. And I think the first track she played was Drunken Angel, which is one of the songs that I've got on here. And I was like mesmerized. And since then, I mean, I've traveled to like 5 or 6 different states to see her play in concert. Yeah. All right. My favorite artist of all, and this has been true for the last probably 15 years, is Iron and Wine. Sam Beam of Iron and Wine is just, to me, nobody writes lyrics, nobody writes music, nobody uses metaphor like Sam Beam of Iron and Wine. And there were several records I could have put on here. I thought about Ghost on Ghost, which was a gorgeous one. But his record, Kiss Each Other Clean, was, for me, just, it takes the cake.
Yeah.
All right. Going back to the very beginning of Billy Joel's career, he did an album called Cold Spring Harbor. And it's one that very few people know. It didn't really have a lot of mainstream hits on it. But for me, I love all of his records, but for me, it takes the cake. And I understand that it's a record he does not like.
Really?
But here's why. And look, I don't know if this is true. I feel like I read it on Wikipedia one time. So folks, this is not informed dialogue.
Wikipedia, that's a good source. Yeah.
But my understanding is that, so his voice sounds just a pitch higher than you would normally think of Billy Joel on this record. And evidently, when this record was made in the 70s, the producer or the engineer or somebody screwed up and they got it just a little too fast.
Yeah.
And so, he got this record and he's like, that's not what this record sounds like. But they put it out.
Has there ever been a remastered version of it put out?
If there is, I don't know about it.
You would think. I mean, it seems like every other song you see on Spotify is remastered.
Right.
That would be something to be...
I never
easy
even
to
thought
be fixed, and maybe he might go, you know what, I love this album now. I don't know.
And so She's Got Away is on this record, but I think the version that everybody knows of She's Got Away is a different version, actually. All right. Well, I told that story a few minutes ago about David Gray, and so David Gray's White Ladder has just a special place for me, always in my heart. All of his music. I've kind of fallen off. I get mad sometimes when a band makes a different sound than what you're used to. I'm like, no, give me more of the same. Give me more of the same.
Right.
And I feel like David Gray is one of those musicians who has actually done that. And then eventually I stopped buying the albums, because I was like, I could just go listen to the older albums. Mm-hmm. And so all respect to David Gray, but I've kind of checked out the last few years of his career. The Dave Matthews Band. You were talking about going to Hastings at midnight for a record release. I was like a late adopter in high school of the Dave Matthews Band. Like Crash was already out and all over the radio. And, of course, Ants Marching had already been big. And I sort of resisted it for a while because I was like, I don't know, everybody's into this, so I don't want to be.
Yeah.
Until one day, I think I was just doing homework at home, and I put on, either Under the Table and Dreaming or Crash, and just was like, this is like magic. I love this,
Which for your younger listeners, it might be kind of foreign to them, but back in the day, you couldn't just put on a record that you didn't own.
That's right.
And so now when you say that, it's like I might just click on some artist I've never heard of, just to see while I'm doing this. But back then, you didn't have that option. You had to go out and buy the record. But my wife was a big Dave Matthews fan back then as well.
So the album Before These Crowded Streets was the first record to come out when I was already like a maniac Dave Matthews fan, And so, Crush was on that record. It had so many good songs. Stay, Wasting Time. That's a one that'll be a love of mine forever as well. All right, Bon Iver, R.E.M. Forever Ago is such a good album, but actually the next album, which was self-titled, just called Bon Iver, is one that's got some tracks that, I think, as an adult, you start getting like a little more high fidelity type of equipment and stuff to listen to music, and I had gotten this set of Bose headphones, and I put on that record, and I heard these sounds in the background, this like atmosphere kind of noise, and I was like,
he's on the track he has a song with Taylor Swift now.
Yeah, Exile.
Yes. Oh, that's such a great. I mean, my kids got me into Taylor Swift, and I'm an unashamed Taylor Swift fan now. And unlike 21 Pilots, they did not abandon me there. But that's a great track that he sings with.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, I was kind of surprised that you didn't have a Taylor Swift album on there, because I remember like when she came out with 1989. I remember how excited you were that record was going to come out.
No, with Taylor Swift, kind of comes in that catching on through my kids. We just sort of hit the Spotify and let it go. So it's kind of hard for me to I don't even always know which album her songs are on. It's just I've spent so much time listening. I know songs. I don't know albums that well.
Yeah.
So
and let me just kind of go out of order here a little bit from what I've got down here in front of me. But one of the other bands that I adore and will forever love is The National.
Yeah.
It's funny. I was listening to this interview with, was it Aaron Dessner or Bryce Dessner from The National, who did the Folklore album with Taylor Swift. It was one of the two guys. But he was talking about how during COVID, and he was making the Folklore album, he had to hide from everybody, even his own family, that he was making this record with Taylor Swift. And at one point he said, his kids were like, "So, Dad, I guess you're kind of famous. Do you know Taylor Swift?" And he was like, I had to sort of like deflect, basically, right, because they were taking me to the airport so I could get on a plane and go meet with Taylor Swift and work on Folklore secretly.
Play it cool, man.
Yeah,
play it cool.
Be cool. But then a later thing he said was once in a while he would put on a National album in the car, and his kids would be like, No. We want to listen to Taylor Swift dad music, not that other dad music.
Oh, that's great.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
Their album, Trouble Will Find Me, there are like 5 different National albums that could go on here, but Trouble Will Find Me was my pick for that. All right, this one's going to seem like, of all the albums, all the great albums that came out in the 90s, it's kind of weird that the ones that made the list for me were like G Love and Special Sauce, Philadelphonic, and Third Eye Blind's self-titled album. First of all, the songs that people know, like Semi-Charmed Life and Graduate, those are bangers, right?
Yeah.
Those are bangers. You get down toward the end of that record, there's a song called In the Background, Motorcycle Drive-By, The God of Wine. There are these beautiful,
now I have to go. Songs. Now I have to go check this out more.
Well, I'll tell you, Motorcycle Drive-By and The God of Wine are both on my list, and those front songs that are the bangers, man, they're great. I'll listen to them every single time.
Probably the best song about crystal methamphetamine that's ever been released, I would think.
Semi-Charmed Life, absolutely. Yeah. All right, we're getting down to the last couple here. I think maybe the first album I bought for myself on CD, which of course it was through Columbia House, was U2's Achtung Baby, because Mysterious Waves was the big single, and that album is killer. But that's not the one that made it for me. The Joshua Tree is the album that made it for me. I think at the end of the day, that one just stands up.
So did you when you picked that album up, was it years after it had come out?
No.
Okay. I was trying to think of the time. I remember when Joshua Tree came out. It was like such a hugely anticipated.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you meant when I picked up Achtung Baby.
No, when you picked up Joshua Tree, I assume it had.
Yeah, actually, it's funny. So Achtung Baby was the first one that I discovered on my own. I think my dad actually already had the Joshua Tree on CD. He had like 10 CDs, kind of developing that early collection. And so I was already exposed a little bit through that.
Yeah, New Year's Day, Sunday Bloody Sunday, that whole era, like early MTV was my sort of first exposure to them. But that Joshua Tree album was like, everybody's waiting to see what that one was like.
And boy, did it deliver. Mm-hmm. Okay, I think this is the last record I've got on my list, and that is MTV Unplugged by Dashboard Confessional. Man, for me, 2002, graduating college, first year of law school, you're leaving behind a lot of people that you love, and you're going into like just a brand new, different world. And there's some melancholy that goes along
Perfect
with that.
For your emo phase. Emo Dude, Mark.
That was my emo phase, man. Hey, and I will put on, I'll do this once in a while, like if I've got to make a long car trip by myself, I will put on Dashboard Confessionals, MTV Unplugged, and just belt every word along to that whole thing for the whole car ride.
Great.
I'll get there with lost my voice, basically.
Yeah.
Hey gang, this is Mark again. Coming back just to wrap up a little bit. This is where we left off during our recording session last week on our discussion of our 20 favorite records playlists. We had a lot of fun talking about these records. I hope you guys enjoyed the show as well. And come on back next Monday as we get into Batman The Long Halloween, Issue 2. And until then, keep reading those comics.